all of those things cost money. And this is our job, this committee, this task force, to look at ways to raise funding for those projects. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Director Pinsky, my co-chair, for any opening remarks you may have.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Co-Chair. I don't think there are any participants today participated yesterday, because it's going to sound like a broken record, because there's another task force on solar incentives, which was encouraged or mandated by the legislature last year. And it's about the process, not about actually content, although I do want to echo, I was struck by the commonality last meeting where, and I don't think there was any coordination, but a lot of the same things were replicated and said in each of the 3 or 4 task groups, which I think always says something. When there's a theme where it's uncoordinated, it says to me, not everybody, but there's a way, there's a thought process that people are sort of adopting the same way. And so I think that's a positive sign. It doesn't mean everybody agrees with it, which I want to get to in a minute. And that is, look, we're getting to the last 6 weeks. There are a few more meetings. I had to schedule an extra 1 or 2. And as we get closer to making decisions, we will not hesitate to surface conversations, even if there are differences.
Yep.
It's healthy, okay? To have what I call ideological struggle, the debate of ideas is healthy. And we don't want people to sit on those ideas and bring them up later.
Yes.
That being said, we also have to make some decisions and recommendations. So I just want to encourage us, and I think the secretary feels the same way, that we want to have robust conversations with the ideas on the floor, and then we're going to discuss and we're going to vote. And we're going to adopt some, and hopefully we'll reach consensus when we can, and in some cases we won't, okay? But after those conversations, debates, and decisions are reached, whereas you might like 4 of the decisions and not 1 or 2 of the others, we strongly encourage you to own the whole report. We know different sectors and segments have different interests, and some would like X or Y or this kind of incentive or conditional and whatever. But we want to have that debate. We want to come to decisions, and then we would like as many of you who feel comfortable with it voting for the final report. And that's not, we're not here twisting arms or saying you have to. If you have unalterably opposed to some of the components, you got to do what you got to do. So I'll hold my substantive comments about the recommendations till we get into that, but I just want us to be a part and parcel of the process. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you. Turn it over to you, Mark.
I'm going to hand it right over to Marshall, who's going to facilitate the first part today.
Absolutely. So pleasure to see you all again, online and in person. With COVID going around, I'm just wearing my mask. If anyone has trouble hearing me at any point, let me know and I can take it off, and that should work okay. But the goals for today, as I said, I'm with, again, for everyone, I'm Marshall Walken, Institute for Market Transformation. We've been supporting MDE on this process and facilitating these meetings. So we're going to be doing 2 main things today, if we can go to the agenda slide. The first, as the co-chairs talked about, we're going to discuss some draft priority recommendations. So there was, you're absolutely right, a lot of commonality between the recommendations from the subgroups. Now, there were some people in multiple subgroups, so I don't think there was coordination, but there were definitely, some voices coming up, hearing voices in multiple groups. So, that is worth acknowledging. But we've sort of taken out what we think from the discussion last time was some of the key priority recommendations and tried to shape that a little more into some language. I'll be presenting that. and we'll be getting feedback and edits on those and identifying additional priorities. And we'll be doing that for the next 70 minutes or so, a little over an hour. And then we're going to discuss funding ideas. AECOM has done some quantitative analysis and come up with some numbers that will help inform the report in terms of the levels of funding needed. And also we can talk about revenue as part of that as well. And that'll be the balance of the meeting, and then we'll have public comments. As a reminder for everyone, our 3 key task force principles that we all agreed on overwhelmingly in a meeting back, I believe in August, was 1, drive early action, 2, equity and housing security, and 3, cost effectiveness. It's helpful to keep that in mind. Next slide. So first 2 recommendations I'm going to share are around workforce development. We've had Darryl from the Emerald Cities Collaborative helped develop some of these and is here as a resource, and I'm going to present the recommendations around workforce and then hand it over to him to provide some more color potentially. So the first, you have these all in front of you, but the first recommendation would be of the ones on workforce development. Maryland Department of Labor should work with MEA, large and small business employers, schools, community colleges, training programs, nonprofits, and labor unions to establish and provide long-term subsidies for pre-apprenticeship pathway programs that have formal relationships or agreements with registered apprenticeship programs, and that are 1, targeted at providing skills needed to decarbonize buildings, and 2, meet the state and federal requirements for the 179D and other tax incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act. The second would be to target building decarbonization workforce programs at youth, returning citizens, veterans, and former fossil fuel workers, with particular prioritization for frontline communities. And if we can go to the next slide, go through this. Specifically with regard to limited income housing, one thing came in the limited income housing group in particular that we wanted to highlight was the need for, as part of workforce development, to incentivize contractors to serve that market and create good jobs again for people in frontline communities with tax credits and training programs and resources for contractors to incentivize that. There are some resources in the Inflation Reduction Act, but there would be benefit to have more here at the state level. So the Emerald Cities Collaborative does a lot of work on workforce development all over the country, and Darryl joined us today, and I'd love to invite him to. He worked very closely with my colleague Cliff Majerzik on helping sort of further refine some of these recommendations over, and I wanted to pass it over to him to add some more sort of color on why, for example, we're talking about pre-apprenticeship or other points you might want to make, Darryl.
Sure. So thanks. It's a real pleasure to be speaking with you about this this important topic. You know, I realize that this comes, of course, in things that you already know, but just so that I'm setting the table within the context of historic investments in building electrification and actually in our country's clean energy infrastructure. It also comes with, you know, I think under the aegis of the Biden administration, which has called for 40% of the federal benefits of federal dollars going to frontline environmental justice communities. So what I would posit is that, you know, in looking at both the historic investments, but also in looking at what the Biden administration is looking to accomplish in terms of bringing individuals from underrepresented groups and communities into this opportunity, and coupled with the fact that much of this is happening where there are widespread workforce shortages, particularly in the construction and therefore in the building electrification industry. So I think in a lot of ways, this is a great opportunity but it also requires an intentional approach to developing the talent, particularly those from underrepresented groups. So I'll lay out what I think are some of the important elements related to getting people into registered apprenticeship. And one of my assumptions here is that building electrification really leverages skills that have been traditionally taught by the skilled trades. So electricians, plumbers, and pipe fitters, all of those types of occupations and skills are really taught in registered apprenticeship training centers. Of course, there are some offshoots related to solar technician, but these are often very much related or adjacent to the electrical trades, for example. So the question that I tried to look at was, how do we get more people from underrepresented groups into registered apprenticeship? And it requires, based on my experience, and also based on many conversations that I've had with folks in the labor movement and also in the trades, that it requires a level of readiness from the perspective of career readiness. That is, people have to have the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors necessary in order to keep and retain a job, and also commensurate with skills and knowledge. It also requires the individuals typically to pass fairly rigorous exams that involve math skills, STEM skills, if you will, at least at the college algebra level, and sometimes at trigonometry level. And so identifying and retaining the talent, particularly from underrepresented groups, is really an all hands on deck situation. It really requires an organization of what we call at Emerald Cities the workforce ecosystem, which includes the small employers, schools, community colleges, training programs, community-based organizations, as well as labor unions. If we are looking at really how these organizations can play together, I think I would offer up a few things. One, that these organizations have to be organized in a way where they are collaborating and also focused on the goals of equity as well as on the goals of skills development. So there has to be a concrete manifestation of those partnerships. People can get around a table and agree to do something and even agree that something is important. But unless they make formal agreements, it probably doesn't mean as much. And so one of the things that I would recommend is that across this ecosystem, facilitating the use of MOUs, memorandums of understanding and memoranda of agreement to ensure that folks are partnering. And then also that there is actually a reinforcement of skills development that's happening across what I call the career pathway. And this would include articulation agreements, or where credit accomplished at earlier stages of this career pathway, say at a school, as an individual is moving into a community college, maybe they're able to get a little bit of additional credit, which gives them a leg up in the community college setting. And also work-based learning experiences. So, part of the work is also cultivating the interest of individuals who may not even know about occupations that are available to them, or the enormous opportunity that are available to them through building electrification. So that requires a level of work-based learning, job shadowing, talking about careers, in the industry in the very early stages, and even with maybe perhaps some incumbent workers, just so that folks are aware and can see themselves in these careers. And then finally, I think there's an important role for the state to play as a convener. That is really signaling to all of these key players, these key stakeholders, that this is important, that there is money and investment behind this, and that that if they work together, that the state of Maryland can be extremely successful in addressing both the issues related to engaging and getting folks from frontline communities into high-paying, high-road occupations. So I'll pause there, and if there are any questions, I'm willing to answer them.
Yeah, I'd ask the task force members if you have questions for Darrell or on this these workforce development priority recommendations. I see the co-chair has a question.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the presentation. Two questions. In the recommendation, it talks about providing long-term subsidies. And at some point in our recommendations and our report to the governor and legislature, they're going to want stuff quantified. It can't be too ephemeral. Do you have any thoughts in terms of the breadth or the basically the amount of what would be meaningful without breaking the bank, knowing there are going to be a lot of demands on the budget and the treasury? That's my first question.
Okay, so in terms of like sources of revenue, I mean, I think there are some promising examples in other states. So for example, the state of Illinois passed in 2021 the Clean Energy Jobs Act, and I think that's probably a good model. I would consider it probably state of the art in terms of how a state is really positioning itself to fund some of this work. So in terms of looking at amounts, I would look to them. I think in terms of sources of revenue, two come to mind. One would be the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which does provide for through the workforce development system for subsidies for workers and also for organizations that successfully meet outcomes. It also has a particular focus on opportunity youth and returning citizens, for example. And so I think it's in many ways, and also in terms of work-based learning. So in many ways, I think it could be aligned, or that source of revenue could be aligned with some of the goals or some of the programming that you'll need to implement. Another thing I'd recommend would be, I know that the Department of Energy and others through the Justice 40 initiative is looking at community benefits planning, and often when developers, for example, are lining up for these projects, it could be written in that they, for example, would subsidize pre-apprenticeship programs, for example, as a part of their work. So those are just two ideas that come to mind, in terms of sources of revenue for this kind of effort.
And one other quick question, which you actually touched on near the end of your comments. In the proposal, talks about pathway programs that have formal relationships or agreements with registered apprentice programs. Besides K-12 upper grades and the community colleges, are there other pathways that we haven't tapped that have some kind of organizational structure that might develop a formal relationship with the apprentice programs that we can look to?
Yeah, so I think that there is the Youth Build program. It's a federal program that where the mission is to engage opportunity youth, people 16 to 24 years old who have left high school. And I believe that under the U.S. Department of Labor, it is considered a pre-apprenticeship program. I worked for that organization prior to coming on board with Emerald Cities, and that organization was able to establish a number of agreements by adopting or agreeing to teach sort of basic construction skills, which were incorporated or which were a part of the building trades multi-craft core curriculum, which is an apprenticeship preparation curriculum that the 14 members of the building trades organized under their apprenticeship. I think it was an apprenticeship training committee of several years ago. So I would look to probably Youth Build. Job Corps also has an infrastructure that could potentially be geared towards this. So those are a couple of federal programs that are probably being implemented in the state of Maryland that you could also tap into. That also includes folks who have left high school. So I think in a lot of ways incorporates a lot of underrepresented groups.
Great, thank you.
I see Cliff, your hand is up.
Thank you, Marshall. One thing I did want to sort of remind folks of is this is something that building owners are looking for because there's certain tax incentives that they can draw on from the Inflation Reduction Act that are 5 times more valuable if they have an apprenticeship program that qualifies. So, for example, the Section 179D tax deduction is worth just $1 per square foot if you don't meet all of the labor requirements, including the apprenticeship requirement, but it can be worth up to $5 per square foot if you are meeting all the labor requirements, including the apprenticeship requirement. And so, Daryl, you mentioned the Illinois CEJA as a good model. Could you say a little bit more about what you think in particular about CEJA is a good model, elements that Maryland would want to be sure to replicate, and also Illinois is about twice the population of Maryland. Would it make sense to be thinking about sort of looking at the Illinois budget and sort of cutting that in half, and that might be a good starting point in terms of answering Director Pinsky's question about how much should Maryland be budgeting for something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of features about CEJA that I think could be quite useful, right? I think one is that the CEJA legislation has mandated what they call both contractor accelerator hubs and then also workforce hubs. And these are what they're calling for is that nonprofit organizations actually are organizing both training infrastructure to move both workers and contractors into the building electrification or clean energy areas. So I think kind of going into a little bit more around the state as convener. You can convene and leverage commitments, but I think the hubs really operationalize that in a pretty useful way. And in fact, in some of the work that we've done with Illinois utilities through our advisory services work, we've recommended that the utilities themselves connect to these hubs as a talent source.
Thank you.
And I see Luke has his hand up online.
Yeah, thank you. I think in relation to Section 179D, I work as a sustainability director here in Maryland for a large property owner, and so I've looked at it quite a bit. A challenge with that particular tax deduction and the apprenticeship requirements is it raises the costs of the work pretty substantially. So, I think something that, Department of Labor and like these sort of programs could help with is making a much closer to parity with using sort of a non-apprenticeship versus an apprentice. By balancing the scales in that way, you kind of improve sort of equity. And I think that could be a really interesting, way that the state could supplement sort of these federal incentives through 179D. Because the economics get really complicated really quickly when you're looking at a big project like this. So that would be my take on that.
I mean, I think that one of the things that is promising about the whole historic investments and the focus on apprenticeship and connections to organized labor is the idea of getting folks into high road occupations, right? And that does, in fact, require a level of investment. Now, so while So I think there's two ideas here, right? One is that yes, the costs are prohibitive, but if we're going to develop the economy of the state and ensure that people have good jobs with benefits, then it may well be worth the investment in terms of tax revenues and the like. I think the other part around are there alternatives to apprenticeship? I think one thing that might be worth exploring are work-based learning opportunities, right? And under the Trump administration, in 2018, they put out a report on apprenticeship expansion and actually laid out an entire framework that really looked at what the number of the range of choices that employers could make as it relates to training new workers. So, and that range from, as I said, job shadowing to internships, to career talks, and then advanced cooperative education. So I think there's a whole range of opportunities there that could be lower costs. But I do want, what I would want to keep in mind is, okay, if you make it cheaper, then are you really lifting all boats, and are you really benefiting the broader community in terms of the high road employment proposition?
Daryl, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time out to participate in this process here in Maryland. One point that I just want to add from MDE's perspective is that as we are doing economic modeling around the pathway report that came out in June, we're seeing that there are thousands of additional jobs that we expect to add to Maryland's economy as we work hard to decarbonize all of our sectors. And of course, a lot of those jobs we expect to be in the trades, as we're hearing here. So just kind of doubling down on the importance of workforce development and thinking about the opportunity that we have to grow the jobs in our state, the types of jobs that those will be, and the programs that need to exist to create the pipeline of people to go into, especially the trades. So anyhow, thank you very much. We should probably move to the next priority recommendation.
All right. Well, thank you. Take care.
Yeah. Can you pull the slides back up for screen share for folks?
Oh yeah, actually, Cindy, I think that's in the room. Can you bring the slides back into main view?
Oh, yes.
I hope that was useful for folks. We'll have to go a little faster on some of the other priority recommendations, but I think it was a really good conversation. And, Darryl for Emerald Cities and Darryl Wright works really closely with IMT, and so it's a resource as we're continuing to develop the report if folks have more questions. The second priority recommendation that came up in pretty much every subcommittee was growing the Clean Energy Transition Hub. And we've written out appropriate $3 to $10 million each year through 2045 to scale up the MEA Climate Transition and Clean Energy Hub that was created by the Climate Solutions Now Act. A well-funded hub could And I'm not going to read out the 12 bullet points or whatever's here. But I wanted to, we can take a moment to look at them, and I wanted to sort of invite folks for sort of questions or things they want to flag here. I will point out that this is a number, 3 to 10. This is not pulled completely out of a hat. IMT looked at the funding level for similar hubs in other jurisdictions. If we took the amount of money that's being spent in DC or New York or other places that have these hubs, St. Louis, and we scaled it by the covered buildings under BEPS, we would be in the $3 to $5 million range. If we scaled it based on the population of the state, we'd be in the $7 to $10 million range. So, which is to say, if the hub is only targeting large commercial buildings, then probably 3 million to 5 million is enough. If it also is going to play a key role with all of the residential buildings, including single family, that's where we get into the $7 to $10 million range if we wanted to actually scale it proportional to the population. So wanted to sort of ask how that landed with folks, if people had questions about specific things they were envisioning the hub could do that aren't flagged here, or questions. And I guess the big question I'd put out to folks is like, do you feel like this hub has a big important role with residential, or is it more on the commercial side? Secretary.
Just trying to remember, it was so much we went through last time.
Totally fine.
Is this not the one where the person reporting said that there's only one person?
Correct. There's currently one.
No, that was, she was sitting over here last week.
Right.
Announced her.
There's one staff person right now for this hub. Most other hubs have been funded through a contract that's been given out to a third party who runs it on behalf of an agency or NGO. And it's been funded usually through a mix of private and public dollars. So you wouldn't have to get that full budget all from government funds, but obviously there needs to be some substantial seed capital.
Yeah, I don't know, just hearing that, realizing that we don't really have, I don't know where this funding will come from. Maybe that's my lack of knowledge, and it's just one person who's devoted to it.
Yeah, right.
In your area, isn't that, yeah, okay,
It's an MEA.
it's coming back. So to approve, to put so much work on an office or a hub with no resources, I
Yes.
don't know, it's just something we should be realistic about.
Yeah,
That's
the list of things the hub could do here is long and would be commensurate, obviously, with the amount of funding. Obviously, this all couldn't be done by one person. I don't know, Director Pinsky.
Well, that's why to me, it seems like a dream instead of reality. Because it's a lot. It's a lot here based on what we have. Anyway, it's your area. So I'll turn it over to you.
No, these are all great questions and they haven't been fully addressed yet. I want to be very frank with, this is making driving the plane while still making it, essentially. When we put this in the climate solutions bill, we thought there should be a coordinator in the buildings area, particularly of matching up needs and services with what was available, as almost a traffic cop, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of our initial thoughts. And obviously, I think we saw most of it in the building sector. I think in the commercial, I think it's not explicit in the law, but I think that was our intent, I think, by and large. So we hired somebody in the last 5 weeks, actually from the U.S. Green Buildings Council, to be the first person. And so, to be very honest, this is going to be an evolving process.
Okay.
And we don't know, how much of these things this hub will do. And we also don't know how quickly our one staffer will be inundated.
Mm-hmm.
So getting back to the secretary's point, we don't know at this time, and I don't want to be greedy. And I also know that the budget we're going to be told, slow down agencies, of how many more people we will need to do this efficiently. That's number one. And how many of these duties that you list here are ones we think we can capably do with that one person, or if a couple more are added over the next couple of years. I do think, you know, you hit on a very interesting point about the private sector taking in some funds,
Mm-hmm.
because they'll be the beneficiary.
Yeah.
That idea of defraying some of the costs. And again, there are enough large buildings particularly that I'm not sure we'd have to, I don't want to use the word TAX, but to assess them to kick in. But I think that would minimize the pressure on the state budget. So I think that's something that we should really consider.
Mm-hmm.
I also, it wasn't clear to me whether we use the $1 to $5 or $6 to $10 million.
Mm-hmm.
How much of that would be on staff and how much would be on program? So, and again, because this is new and our first hub person only came on 5 weeks ago, we're still trying to figure this out. And
Yeah.
and while my staff, Ian Holman, many of you know, and myself, shaped this in the law 2 years ago or whenever it was, it's one paragraph. We didn't spell it out because it's new, and we're still trying to figure all this stuff out. So
Yeah.
that's a little context.
That's super helpful, Director. I mean, I think that this was something we were hearing from the subgroups, from task force members, as something that they saw was important and could be scaled up. In context in DC, where there's a building innovation hub, that hub is funded about half of it comes directly from the government, and another half through the DC SEU, another quarter through the SEU, which still comes from the government. So it's about 3/4 government funded, and the remainder is sort of private. Cliff could probably correct me on the exact numbers, but and I see his hand up, so maybe he could speak to this even better than I can in terms of the budget here. But certainly some of that staff and some of that obviously is various studies they've funded, resources that are put out, events and so forth. Cliff, do you want to speak to this question?
Sure. Yeah, the DC hub's budget for the next year is going to be about 850,000, and that's overwhelmingly labor. That could be done in-house by MDE employees, or it could be outsourced to third parties. So you're talking about it's labor intensive, the list of items that you see here, and the DC hub does not serve the single family sector. It's really focused on commercial and multifamily buildings. And of course, they're helping their buildings comply with the building energy performance standard in DC. So that would be, I think, probably job number one for a hub in Maryland, would be helping buildings to comply with the building energy performance standard in Maryland. And there's the kinds of things it's doing is listed there, but it's directed by building owners and service providers. They do provide the rest of the funding for it, and it's very responsive to them. And some folks prefer to have a third party in the sense that they can talk directly to the hub and say, I'm not really sure if I'm in compliance with BEPS. Can you help me figure that out? And sharing that directly with the government sometimes is a less comfortable conversation, because the government is also, of course, the enforcer of the law.
Just to throw out something, if you don't agree, like you said, please speak up. I think with this one, because we have so many other ones
Yeah.
to get through, we already have the hub. These are expanded roles that we can think about later. Or maybe after we get through some of these other
Sure.
ones, and only because we have someone, So I think we should just kind of move on, since we've made some
Yeah.
progress already, and just go to the next.
That sounds.
Oh,
Just
So please
kind
go ahead.
of raise one thing, is that the hubs, from the review of affordable housing, multifamily
Uh-huh.
properties, super important to have a resource that people can go to. And so, yes, would be cost, but it's a pretty low cost in terms of, say, it's $1 million for hub, that I think is really important.
Thank you. That's what we heard, I think, from a lot of folks. This is why we have this in here. I was gonna, move us on as well. The next one was a one-stop shop for limited income housing. This overlaps somewhat with what we have already talked about, but the idea is DHC should be given funding to expand and staff up a one-stop shop to provide entry point for all programs serving limited income housing, including naturally occurring affordable housing. They will take a whole home approach, addressing barriers, providing audits, looking at the electrical load, covering the soft costs and the other upfront costs, including technical assistance for project design, energy audits, panel upgrades, weatherization, etc. We've listed some precedents here, including the DCSU retrofit accelerator models in Philadelphia as well. And usually the way this is done is there's portals specific to the customer type and their unique challenges, and then there are sort of navigators who help people through the process. Cliff, did you want to add more to this? I mean, we should toss it over to Nicola from.
Yeah, and Nicola, if you want to add any color on that.
I think this recommendation builds on a report that was issued earlier this year called Charting a Pathway to Maryland's Equitable Clean Energy Future. And I see Ruth Ann has raised her hand, so maybe she wants to add more from that perspective. But it's building on that report and on an approach that is already in process to some extent, to have for the disadvantaged communities, one entry point is very important. And it is a building sector with very unique challenges with, a lot of deferred maintenance, old building stock that is a little bit unique compared to other buildings, to more of the commercial or market rate buildings. So the work group, the subgroup, thought that, since this is model already building and there's precedent for it, that it would be a good idea to formalize this approach for Maryland.
Ruth?
Ruth Ann, but thank you.
Sorry.
Hey, everybody. I just, building on that, I wanted to say, the Maryland example of where this is happening is in the nonprofit sector at the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative. We actually were the ones who worked with the Obama administration to build the Align, Braid, Coordinate model that PEA and the Built to Last program in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia and others around the country now use. But I will, but as the housing co-chair for Governor Moore's transition team, this was a recommendation in the DHCD housing transition. DHCD has picked this up with great velocity, and it is a cross walk over to a different task force for green and healthy homes for DHCD on the implementation. I think the thing here is to ensure that at the federal coordination side, right, and level of this, that it is being coordinated not only at DHCD, but where other important entities across the state come into this from a housing standpoint, and that includes MEA, it includes MDH, and others. And so just wanted to say the data bears out on this, the efficiencies bear out on it. And the fact of the matter is, even in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, when they launched it, the vice president talked about it. They've talked about it at EPA for a long time. We have to take care of the toxic materials like lead, asbestos, radon, things like mold, mildew, and moisture, and other things that will degrade our ability to add solar or decarbonize or electrify if we don't take this approach. So just want to strongly support Nicola and the recommendation here. And we have a lot of data on this. Happy to share with the committee as it is needed.
Are there other task force members with questions or comments on this recommendation, or things they would prefer to see any edits to text? We can wordsmith later too, but.
I think some of the things I was saying, I think should be put in text, so I'm happy to work with you.
All right, well, yeah, we're capturing your comments in the notes, and we'll make sure to do that, so appreciate that. Not seeing anyone else, so we can move on to the next recommendation then. The next one was financing renovations. This came up again in pretty much every. So to provide ratepayers with on-bill repayment options to finance efficiency and electrification projects Options include inclusive utility investment, where the utility finances projects and receives a rate of return, or third-party financing, where the bill includes a pass-through repayment that then transfers with the utility bill. The other recommendation here is increase other low-cost financing options, including and especially the Maryland Green Bank and other green banks. Questions or comments on this financing recommendation? I see a hand up.
Hey, Mark Dunscott, and just to the comments that the secretary and the director were making earlier about being specific and trying to find sources of capital. I think there's an enormous pool of private capital that would come in to support these kinds of renovations. What I think would be very helpful for the unrated credit market, in other words, the private building owners, not the municipal or the school districts, but for private building owners, is some kind of a pool that might have some state support, not necessarily state capital, but some state support. So to help with the underwriting of some large number of small credits that would go into this pool. It could be an evergreen kind of a pool of capital as well, that once a portfolio of loans was put together, they could be securitized, sold out to the market. And then the state or the county's guarantee could be applied to a new pool of capital. I think it might be some way to lessen the burden to the government entities, but still provide a place where building owners could go to find financing for, specifically for renovations, green energy renovations.
Is this,
Secretary?
yeah, is this the recommendation where, I don't see him here today, it was a representative?
Our case from BGE.
Yes,
Yeah,
he had,
Concerned about the utility fee.
yeah, he did one,
Part of it.
right. So we're,
That's right. So from the utility perspective, and he sent a note saying that he couldn't attend today, but also kind of doubling down on his comments last time that he wanted, shared that that the utilities don't want to necessarily be on the hook to be the financer
Right.
to provide that financing, but there was some I think willingness on their part to be a pass through. So that they're on the utilities bill, there could be that option for a third party financer to be paid monthly through the utility bill. In that case, it's just a billing issue for the utility to have to manage.
but I
That's
think,
certainly good. That's certainly an approach. You could also, again, just have a pool of capital that building owners would come to finance the renovations that they were required to make to meet the BEP standards.
Right.
I saw another hand. Joe, did you have I see a hand over there?
Yeah, I mean, New York has the New York Green Bank, which does something similar where they're pooling together loans and then institutions can come in and buy those loans. So that's one kind of way of going about it. There's also the CPACE program, which is another way for financing. I don't know if we're going to get to that at some point, but that's another way of financing renovations. And then the other one is energy as a service contract. So there are companies out there that will, for low upfront or no upfront cost, will finance renovations and then have to pay ongoing payments for that. So that's a way to take away the burden of the upfront.
Yeah. I think did we?
No, I mean, I
Okay.
echo what you were saying.
Yeah, and I think,
just,
go on,
if I could for
Secretary.
a second, I just want to make sure, so where are we with, when we bring these up, like this financing issue, are we talking about making this stronger, or we're just getting more comments
Well,
for this one like we did last time?
we would like to get is some degree of consensus on these being recommendations. So I think one question I'm hearing here, especially in light of Mr. Case's comments, is like, do we want to continue, do the rest of the task force members think it's important to continue to include inclusive utility investment as in utility financing as one of the options here in the recommendation, or does that get struck and it focuses just on pass through of third party financing?
Well, and just one point of clarification on that is that the utilities are supportive of inclusive utility investment where they would receive a rate of return.
Oh, yes.
For equipment that they fund themselves, which is different from the utility providing its own financing, being required to finance on bill repayment programs.
Okay, and so that third option of them financing it directly was struck from the recommendation. I apologize, I got confused there.
Okay.
That's different than financing though, if they're supplying, I'm just not sure it comes under, not saying yes or no to what it should be done, but it seems to come under something different than financing renovations, if they're actually essentially selling the equipment to people.
Well, also, wouldn't that fall under Public Service Commission? Obviously, they're a regulated utility, and it just might add another layer. And I'm not saying they should be involved or shouldn't be involved. I mean, I have strong opinions on other areas. On this one, if they don't want to get in the business, I guess that's their choice.
Yeah, they would have to approve this, right?
Can I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So two of the utilities have filed plans to do this with the PSC, right? Baltimore BGE has, Mark's not here, but he was obviously involved in some of the development of that proposal. The PSC has deferred consideration of that proposal for now. They're likely to take it up, I think, sometime next year after their rate case is resolved. And then the other Exxon utility, TEPCO, also has made a similar proposal. So those are going to come before the PSC one way or another, and they'll have but this body would have an opportunity if we want to weigh in on it.
Okay.
I just, and I'm in a cynical mood today. I would be more comfortable if we say finance efficiency and electrification projects, if there's some sort of proviso in here that this isn't going to include more efficient gas equipment.
It's beneficial.
There's a separate priority recommendation that we'll get to in a moment about shifting resources away from gas equipment.
And I know that I'm just looking at the phrasing specifically.
Yeah.
Here.
You're saying you want that reflected here as well.
Explicit.
And basically just this phrase here is finance efficiency and electrification projects, which I think is great. I'm just saying I'd like a little bit something added that this is not efficiency of natural gas equipment.
Okay.
We can wordsmith and find a solution there, I think.
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Other comments on this one? See Mark from OPC has his hand up.
Yeah, hi, this is Mark Shivas from Office of People's Counsel. I just wanted to address the BGE and PEPCO proposals that were referred to earlier. Office of People's Counsel actually filed a motion in BGE's rate case to strike the program that would have provided rebates for certain electrification on the theory that it wasn't properly designed and would have resulted in an excess cost to ratepayers. I haven't looked personally at the program in PEPCO's rate case, but the commission struck that BGE proposal from the rate case, I think accurately without prejudice to consideration in other forums, including potentially in power. But we had pretty serious concerns about, among other things, the bang for the buck that the customers would get, and the fact that that particular program was tied to a BGE vision for electrification that would be linked to gas infrastructure. Among other things, electrification rebates would have been conditioned on customers committing to maintain their gas furnaces to get any rebate from an electric heat pump, which we considered not a prudent path forward and not acceptable. So all that to say, I think wordsmithing this would be good in part because I'm not sure that the definition or characterization of inclusive utility investment here is there. I think it may need to be tweaked a little bit for this one.
Okay. I'm hearing a lack of consensus on the text as drafted, some clear recommendations for edits, and probably more wordsmithing than we have time for in the next 20 minutes.
But
Yeah.
Mark and others, I mean, if you want to email any suggestions that you have for amendment language, again, we're not voting on anything today, right? This is all about just reviewing these discussion drafts and then getting this exact input so that we can
Super helpful.
bring new drafts back to you next time.
It's exactly the sort of feedback we wanted on this text. So this is really great. Any last comments on this one before I move on? I see the, oh,
I think we need to.
okay, let's move on. So speaking of your point on gas, the next one was end investment in new fossil fuel equipment and infrastructure, specifically redirect state investments, including STRIDE and Empower programs to support decarbonization instead of supporting new natural gas equipment or new natural gas infrastructure.
I just want to make one clarification, just so that I know. Me personally, I think this is a great one, personally, but not even a but. I know the electricity sector will say they need to, now this says new natural gas equipment or infrastructure, but I always hear we need to ensure that we're updating the pipes.
Mhm.
Does this prevent that?
Can I answer that?
Anyone?
I think there's two different issues here.
Okay.
One is, STRIDE, the STRIDE program is a financial incentive for replacing pipes. They're replacing pipes, whether they're dangerous, whether they're replacing every pipe in the state. That's the problem. You know, they have an obligation under another statute to replace leaky or risky pipes. And nobody is saying anything about that here. No one's trying to prevent that. It's, media has, told us they're intending on spending $2 billion just to replace all the pipes in Baltimore City. So that's the investment we're trying to stop, is the replacing it just to replace and locking it in for another 30 or 40 years, which is how long it takes to pay for pipe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. So this is about, obviously, yeah, they have legal obligations to replace leaking pipes and deal with gas leaks that are hazardous. This is about saying Empower would no longer incentivize new gas furnaces or gas burning equipment, and we wouldn't be investing in just pipe replacement for the sake of pipe replacement, or expansion of the gas network, I think would sort of also be included there.
It sounds like fleshing.
This is very short text, so there's certainly room for more text here.
But adding to that could be beneficial since there's already some questions around it.
That's what I think.
If Susan, you wanted to offer some additional language, I think
What you need it by?
we meet again, I think in 2 weeks. It'd
So
be great-
before then.
Yeah, if let's say within the next week, you're able to send additional language, that would.
Getting shorter as your sentence goes on.
So if by 2 minutes from now you had that to us.
Getting it to us by the end of next week would allow us to make sure we include it in what is brought to the next meeting. If it comes later, it might just be something we have to discuss at the meeting. So, yes,
Just a clarification on intent. Say redirect state investments, and then we're referring to program. What about state funding of construction? So constructing a new state building or giving a local jurisdiction money to construct a school, is that included in here? If it is not, should it be? If it is, shouldn't it be?
yeah, Ian? Do you have a
They're
comment?
ratepayer funded programs, just to be clear.
Yeah.
So it might be a little complicated to do that, right? It is not taxpayer funded.
These are about ratepayer funded programs. So actually saying state investments might be the wrong phrase there, because these are really about ratepayers programs. Whether or not the state should be investing in new gas equipment and buildings that it owns and manages and finances is a separate question that maybe also should be addressed here, but was sort of not as much, I think, in the scope of the conversation within the subgroups at least. But certainly could be brought up now, as it is being brought up.
What do people think? Should we, I thought it actually did possibly came up in the,
Yeah, it came up in our discussion because there is we all know there's a big delta between existing conditions with, let's say, just a gas-fired boiler going to electric heat pumps. There's a big cost differential, and would eliminating any funding, any subsidy to allow this inefficient customer, whatever they are, let's say they're using gas, to make an efficient, more energy efficient gas selection, because they can't bridge that delta to go from completely inefficient to electric. Do we want to completely eliminate any incentive to at least make a step towards being more progressive, saving more energy, being more energy efficient without going to gas or going to electric because you can't afford that full delta?
I think the argument that I heard from a number of members of this, other members of this task force and subgroups, which I've also heard in other settings, is there are gas equipment. It's all, as you said, it can be more expensive to electrify. That means the gas equipment is already cheaper. Maybe you don't need an incentive to do it. And in fact, with the equipment lifetimes, we're locking in equipment, especially on commercial buildings, we're locking in equipment that will still be operational past the 2040, 2045 deadlines the state has if we're funding new gas equipment. So this is about ratepayer funds that incentivize this or support pipe replacement and that sort of thing. There's a separate question that I'm raising here that I want to highlight about whether the state should be paying at all for any new gas equipment in any buildings it owns or manages. You could have potentially a process wherein that is either not allowed or where it's allowed but has to be argued for. And there's like, instead of it by default allowed, like they have to sort of, the school wants to not electrify and they have to like make the case for why they can't do that and get a waiver or something. I know that's certainly how gas investment is working in DC right now. So.
There's a hand up
Yeah,
from Senator
sorry.
Kramer.
Didn't see that. Apologies. Senator Kramer?
Yes, thank you. And I just wanted to offer some comment, and I think Director Pinsky will understand that the issue with Stride is going to, I think, have to be finessed. I have been on committees where the Stride bills came many years ago for gas, which I was one of very few legislators who voted against Stride. However, it did pass. In recent years, there have been efforts by the electric utilities to get a Stride model. Again, I have not been supportive. I just think we need to take a look carefully at how we look to sort of maybe unwind what we've already done. But I agree that continuing to put new investment of ratepayer funds into gas infrastructure that is under the plan going to become obsolete will result in a significant dollar amount of stranded costs that then are going to come back to the state or the ratepayers looking to backfill. So, I get the concept, but I think it's going to have to be very carefully finessed as to how, it's addressed and starting to pull back now on what actually has been, I guess, maybe about 10 years now policy. And how it's going to happen. So I think that's something that, at some point, we just need to take a close look at how we're going to do that. And just while I've got the floor, and then I'll shut up. And again, this is kind of maybe for Director Pinsky. The question is, what of the proposals will require legislative action? And is there any interest in trying to pursue legislative action for the upcoming legislative session? Or is the goal here just to put the parts in place? And then if things require legislative action, it will be going forward in future years. So I just wanted to maybe get a handle on that and some idea of what the end game is if you don't mind, Director.
Yeah, I'll start, but then I'll have my co-chair also answer. I think that's an open question, Ben. I think one, we won't get a report done till December. And there's another issue that's overlapping with this, obviously, the implementation plan that Department of Environment's working on the climate solutions bill. So look, this was given to, this came out of the Climate Solutions Now Act, MDE and MEA is looking at it. Look, I feel strongly in support of a number of these proposals. And as you, I voted against the stride bill. And then at one point, it only passed by a couple of votes. So that was very controversial back in the day. So I would love to see a number of these implemented at ASAP. But again, you know, this is an issue where the executive department is going to get involved. The legislature themselves going to get involved. Will it happen in 24 or 25? I think the jury's still out. I think it would be premature, at least for me, to go beyond that.
I agree.
Okay, I see Scott from DHCD had his hand up, and then I think we'll have to move on to the next recommendation to keep on time.
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon, and thank you. It might just be a quick question. So the header of this is for ending investment in new fossil fuel equipment, but the recommendation is related specifically to gas equipment and infrastructure. Is that the case because it is specific to the STRIDE and Empower programs, or is this intended to cover more than just natural gas?
Are you thinking about fuel oil and other issues there? Is that right?
Other fossil fuels, right?
Yeah, I think the reason this talks about gas is because it was talking about the Empower and STRIDE programs that are focused on that. But certainly, I think that especially if we were talking about, you know, other funding sources, that would need to include other fossil fuels as well.
All right. Yeah.
So we can try to address that in the wordsmithing.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Good discussion. So the last sort of priority recommendation, and I'll hand it over to AECOM to talk about some of the research they have done and stop talking, which will be nice, is tax incentives. This is a recommendation for a recommendation, I suppose, but the Comptroller's Office should recommend to the General Assembly and the Governor potential long-term tax incentives to encourage owners to decarbonize their buildings, with particular emphasis on exceptionally cost-effective time windows, such as when a building is being renovated for other reasons, including office to residential conversion. The recommendation would need to respond to the urgency of the climate crisis and consider simplicity in program design, performance metrics, consolidation of existing incentives, alignment with federal, state, and local incentives and labor standards, long-term costs and benefits, including relating to financing, social, and environmental factors. That's a bit of a mouthful. If I could just put a little bit of color on this, my take is the reason this is being written this way is that there were, Director and Secretary, there were about 1 million good tax incentive ideas, all being advanced by individual people in subgroups with no consensus about any particular idea. Everyone was like, we should do this. And everyone else was like, well, that's an interesting idea. Maybe I'm mischaracterizing it somewhat or putting too broad a gloss on it. But that's, I think, part of why this ended up being sort of a recommendation for further study. That was at the subgroup level. If the task force members have, you know, more consensus on a clear recommendation around tax incentives, especially once we hear some stuff from AECOM around finance, you know, suddenly that's could be in the report for sure. Any questions, comments on this?
I just add to that I think in some cases, especially speaking as an engineer, not an accountant, I'm listening to this, I'm like, I guess that's a good idea. And so it's just that there wasn't enough ability to evaluate some of these recommendations.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Omnibus was instead.
That's a really good point. It's not just that like they were odd ideas, it was that, you know, it wasn't a bunch of tax experts.
And, you know, as we transition to Julia at AECOM, I think that we're actually going to have an opportunity to revisit this point right here around if the task force has any suggestions for tax credit or other incentive-based programs that work for large buildings. That is a specific task that one of the reasons that we contracted with AECOM to help us with the analysis piece was to be able to provide that service to the task force to help us figure out, well, what might that look like? How much would that cost the state? How would that apply at the building project level? So why don't we transition to Julia, and this piece specifically will have an opportunity, I think, to come back to.
Yeah, unless there's any other comments on this first before we do that, otherwise I'll
I'd
take it.
just say to consider, just like with 179D, the effect on nonprofits and other organizations that would not necessarily.
Yeah, that needs to be highlighted. Okay, good, really good point. Next liability. Okay. Well, we're 5 minutes ahead of schedule if we're gonna move on.
Wow.
Yeah, amazingly. Seeing no other hands, and none online, I'll pass it back to you to provide any introduction you want to Julia's presentation.
Okay, and actually, I think that we are still actually behind schedule because the funding piece was actually separate from Julia's.
Oh, you're right.
But anyhow, nonetheless.
We're very behind schedule. I'm sorry.
Julia, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will try to be quick and conscious of time. As the technical partner here, our goal was really to provide analysis on what some of the costs could be for some of these potential recommendations. So listening to all the recommendations coming from the subgroups and the task force, we have taken some of those, especially focused on supporting low-income communities and looking at other ways of getting contractors involved and considering ways to support the BEPS buildings to try to put some numbers on those on potential programs. So that's the analysis that I'll be providing now, and very open to commentary on it and how that could apply more specifically to some recommendations. So go to the next slide, please. So one of the questions that we looked into was what it would look like if the state were to cover 100% of the additional cost of installing heat pumps for low-income homes and half of that for moderate-income homes. And this is covering the gap of installation for like replacement versus electrifying. So that's the component that this number is covering here for all households. And what that looks like is about $10.3 billion to cover that gap of moving from a like-for-like replacement to electrify with heat pumps. The annualized cost in 2025 would be $593.4 million. However, there is an expectation that there's going to be a change in cost of both technology and labor. Heat pumps are expected to become more affordable, and labor costs will change. So that was built into this analysis, which is why the annualized cost of this gap in 2044, which is the end of the 20-year time frame, would be $445 million. So something to add to this number in general that is not that easy to quantify at this exact moment is that there are expectations that there will be other programs that are supporting the installation of heat pumps in residential homes, especially in low-income homes, such as changes to Empower and other programs. So realistically, the total gap that needs to be covered to support upgrading to heat pumps for residential homes is expected to be less than this number. But this is what that number looks like right now if the state wanted to cover the cost gap of moving up to heat pumps.
Much less.
Yeah, we talked about the fact of something we were talking about was considering perhaps half that number, considering other programs and things that are going to be ongoing. They're just also in development, so it would be challenging to include them in the analysis to get an actual number. So this is big picture what it looks like.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, question. I'm trying to understand the meaning of additional cost. So I assume this means replacing existing, whether they're failing or not. I mean, there have been conversations that when one fails, you put in the heat pump. And so you lower the cost, and we don't get the emissions reductions as quickly as we would like. But of course, it does lower the cost. And then it's just really the marginal cost of replacing an old heat pump, an old failing gas furnace with a heat pump. And there would be the marginal cost because the replacement would be needed. Now, I know there's somebody who's not here will say you need a backup and a backup and a backup, but he's not here, so I can make fun of him. So I'm a little unclear of additional cost. Does that mean in toto, if we replace every gas-fired furnace or boiler or hot water heater in every low-income home?
Yeah, those are all good questions. So first of all, the additional cost is referring to the base cost being a like-for-like replacement of the current fossil fuel fired heating equipment. So that's the base cost, and then a heat pump would cost more than that. So that's the gap that we're talking about to get to electrification, plus upgrading the electric panel to support that. And this is looking at replacement at end of equipment life for current equipment. So not replacing something that's brand new, but over the course of the 20 years that it's expected to take to do this electrification, the existing equipment will reach end of life. And Marshall makes a good point, just a note that this is based off of Rewiring America's numbers on these base costs of the gap to electrify.
So let me just restate, I want us to be on the same page.
Yeah.
So these are the additional costs above and beyond replacing with like those failing systems using a 20-year life cycle.
Over 20 years to decarbonize that whole sector. Right now with Rewiring America's and base analysis, it's expected that there's an additional 12 grand per household for low income households needed from a base replacement cost to do a heat pump electrification. So that's an additional $12,000 for each household, which rolls up into this number.
And I would assume if this is over 20 years, it's assuming 5% will die or be replaced every year for 20 years, which gets you to 100%.
The 20-year time frame. So yes, to answer that question, and that's what the expectation is: 20 years to decarbonize that whole group of buildings.
Thank you.
One quick point is that a piece in the rewiring analysis that drives these numbers up is the assumption that every house is going to need a panel upgrade to accommodate this. It's likely that not every single house is going to need a panel upgrade to switch to a heat pump. So there are several factors that, and I think really importantly, as Julia mentioned, this isn't including the electrification that's going to happen under Empower or people naturally, natural replacements that, not taking advantage of incentives, people taking advantage of the federal tax credit for heat pumps, so on and so forth. There's a lot of reasons to look at this as a pretty high ceiling.
Right, but Empower does not fund heat pumps.
And not currently, right. So I'm speculating that in the future it might.
Yeah, I would love it to. Yeah. The other of the $12,000 marginal cost, how much of that goes to panel upgrade?
It was about 2,000. I see Jamal's hand up from Rewiring, so I'll let him speak to that. The other thing I would just say before I hand it off to Jamal is, yes, not every home would need a panel upgrade. It's also, this is taking this as in isolation, as if this was the only reason to do it. For example, You talked about yesterday, there was the solar meeting. If people are putting solar on the roofs, they're probably going to need a panel upgrade to support that, and you could fund it through that effort instead for those homes. Jamal?
Yeah. A couple other considerations, and I'll answer the panel upgrade question too. We there's a a full distribution of costs that is going to be necessary to transition certain buildings. It's going to cost less for some buildings, it's going to cost more for some buildings. And we basically modeled those modeled our numbers based on the 75th percentile, as opposed to taking the average or the median, and try to capture a few more of those households that are on the more costly end. So this is a pretty conservative number that does include panel upgrades, and I actually believe that the panel upgrade was 4,000, not 2,000.
Okay, sorry.
That's included, I thought.
It does include the panel upgrade, yes.
Yeah, at 4,000. And actually, Julia, you might want to go to the next one, because the analysis that AECOM did for this idea, which is very related, it's really looking at it from just a different lens. So go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can explain why the numbers look different as well. So the concept here is continuing to extend the Inflation Reduction Act HEAR rebate after it's projected to end. So that's the Home Electrification and Appliances rebate program that's built into the IRA to help electrify homes. And the state of Maryland is supposed to be allotted $68 million. And it's actually, there is a projection that that might actually run out by the end of 2024. So the analysis that we did here was saying, if we take the actual incentive per home that is given under HEAR per low income home and moderate income home, and we extend out that cost and remove the 68 million, what does that cost look like? So just continuing the HER rebate as it exists, but offering it to low income homes and moderate income homes. So the total cost for that is 14.23 billion, and that's annualized over the same 20 years to 711 million. I will, just to make sure it's very clear, the difference here is that the first analysis was focused on the gap between like-for-like replacement and a heat pump installation. This is just an incentive that goes straight to a heat pump installation, almost regardless of the like-for-like replacement. So this is going the amount that goes per home to the overall cost of purchasing a heat pump.
I noticed that the hand up from Luke. Sorry, that may have been a holdover from the last slide.
Luke had his hand up before Jamal. Apologies. Or after Jamal. Luke?
Yeah, no worries. My question was related to there was talk of like the low and middle income folks, those households. Would that be inclusive of sort of naturally occurring affordable housing, or would it be kind of like that separate block of like income verified folks, which is it's just a different group than people who live in what's considered naturally occurring affordable? And I think it's an important distinction, because the group in naturally occurring affordable are going to be, it's just a much larger group. So I'd be curious if like the goal of some of these initiatives would be focused on naturally occurring.
I think naturally occurring is included, yes. Right,
It's based, the analysis that we did here is based off of Rewiring America's analysis, and they did it off of average median income. So that's the low income would be considered less than 80% of the average median income, and the moderate is 80 to 150% of the average median income. So it's specifically based off of those numbers.
Which means, just Luke, which means because it's not based on the buildings, but based on the homeowners, it would by definition include people living in naturally occurring affordable housing, but that's not that lens was not relevant in the way the analysis was done.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Any more comments on this one? I see.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to digest here, and I'm not sure I fully understood all the assumptions and calculations that went into here. I assume all of these numbers came from worksheets that used both assumptions and had different formulas. Could you provide those? I think that would be helpful in just digesting these numbers and you know, possibly offering recommendations for revision.
We did come off of calculations and we do have some spreadsheets. I will leave that up to MDE to determine to share.
Yeah, that's that is our norm and our hope to be able to be as transparent as possible with all these things.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, we can do that.
Clarification.
Please.
I mean,
Director.
this is beyond the IRA money. I mean, I hate to call it monopoly money, but we have no clue whether this money is going to be available. I mean, obviously IRA passed. Maryland's going to get some money for the, you know, to spend over the next 4 or so years. But beyond that, this may or may not come to fruition.
Right. Yeah, and this was attempting to answer the question. We stand up those programs, right, based on the federal funding. And once that federal funding runs out, what would it cost Maryland to keep those programs running, to offer exactly those same incentives to everyone until every single home is electrified? And again, there are reasons why these numbers are perhaps higher than they would need to be in reality, but you know, we can look at this as probably a ceiling for what that could cost over a 20 years.
Right. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, the goal here is we want to, as Mark said, this is a ceiling for what this could look like, but it gives the task force numbers to contextualize this issue and consider what kind of boundaries might be able to be put on a program that could offer some of this support. Perhaps it would not be for every single home. Perhaps there are some limitations. Perhaps the amount per home might change, and we can do analysis on that as well. But it's going to be beneficial for having a budgeting conversation and putting some specifics on these recommendations was the hope.
All right, Julie, do we want to move on to the next in the interest of time?
Yep, absolutely. So another question that came up was focusing on how to incentivize contractors to support low to moderate income homes that need to be doing all this work to electrify. So in our research and analysis, we came up with, we've identified 3 different types of programs that could provide that kind of support, either any of which could go into a recommendation, but the first would be to provide a financial incentive to a given contractor for each LMI household that they serve. This program cost could be $20.6 million to $51.4 million, and it's actually based on existing funding that's coming out through the Inflation Reduction Act as well. So there's HER funding, which provides up to $200 per home per contractor that works with them, and the HER funding would be $500 per home, and you cannot apply for both. It's significantly less than what would go to a homeowner, which makes sense, but it does provide some incentive for contractors to start supporting this work in low-income homes. So similarly, we took that framework and applied it to all homes in that sector, which gives the range of 20.6 to 5.1 million, since the rebate could range from $200 to $500 per contractor. The second option is to provide a financial incentive to organizations that want to support workforce development in building decarbonization space while partnering with a local contractor. So this ties in the workforce development piece as well. And this is based off of the Illinois Climate and Equitable Jobs Act that we discussed a good amount earlier in this meeting, because there's a lot of good content in what they've done here that relates to these recommendations. So in that program, there is a cap of $10,000 per participant that is enrolled, and they have an $80 million cap per year that they put towards this program. And they have a nonprofit organization that can go for this cap to support workforce development and partner with a contractor. So that's a second option, and what that current framework looks like. A third option is to provide a financial incentive to a given group of state-approved contractors that could serve local areas. And while there's not an explicit example of this happening with any funding backing it, there are states like NYSERDA has lists of state-approved contractors that can be used for specific work. So this would be a continuation of that, using a state-approved list of contractors designed to support low-income homes and providing some incentives to them. The thought being that there would be a smaller group of contractors serving a larger group of low to moderate income homes. So those are three different options with potential funding quantities that could support them.
Nicola?
Yeah, I have a question. So for our weatherization programs, we do have state-approved contractors that are paid for doing the work. So I think I'm having a hard time understanding. We would be paying them for the work and then an additional incentive on top. Is that what the idea is here?
Yeah, the goal is to specifically increase their support in the low income homes that need additional support, which is something that is actually being done in the Inflation Reduction Act.
Okay. So if they're paid though adequately for the work, what the work costs and their overhead, and they're being paid for that, they're getting business and they're getting reimbursed and profit. So they would get an additional incentive on top of that.
Specifically in that sector, yes.
Nicola, am I hearing you say that you think that there's adequate state program support for contractors that do work in affordable housing currently?
So we hire contractors every 3 years, and we are looking to increase the number of contractors working. But I think I'm just having a hard time understanding they're getting free leads, so they get the work handed to them. They don't have to go out and do business acquisition for these customers. They are getting paid the labor and the cost of materials and their profit margins. And so I'm just wondering, what more incentive is needed to do that work that is already more that they're getting if they're doing work on their own out in the free market.
I do want to make a point that this is targeted at non-weatherization work, such as the heat pump installation and electric panel upgrades we were talking about, just to be clear.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just saying that model already exists, and it could work, in a different for different industries as well, not just for weatherization.
Okay. Well, Nicola, I mean, I'm a big fan of keeping it simple. So I guess I wonder if there's any suggestion that an existing state program be, expanded, reinforced, so on and so forth to accomplish bigger objectives, then I think that we should probably really focus there instead of trying to come up with new ideas, right? Building on what we have that seems to be successful is a good model to use.
If I could, Mark, following up, I think one of the concerns has to do with a large number of contractors who aren't working with these pumps. And the idea of getting more people to open up that blockage. And I agree with you. I think we have to be creative. We got to look at solutions. Well, I hear what you're saying. They're getting paid for their hourly work. The people who are working in that field, why do they need more money? I hear that. I also hear that there are not enough contractors who are familiar with working in the heat pump area who are trying to, when they go out to a home where the gas furnaces died, of selling heat pumps or selling the installation of the heat pump because they haven't worked with it, not familiar with it, don't have a supplier. And again, I don't know what the answer is. We've been talking about it at MEA for a while now. of getting more contractors aware and involved and engaged. And we're still looking for solutions as well. And I mean, I understand probably where this is coming from. I just don't know what the best approach is.
I see Scott's hand up.
Hi, yeah. So I guess maybe a couple comments. Nicola was saying that we're aiming to get more contractors into our programs, which is certainly true. And sometimes it's a challenge, and sometimes it's a challenge because contractors don't want to work with the state because of requirements that the state has. Our programs are pretty stringent with work quality, and oftentimes contractors are called back to do and correct the work that they did, or go back and do the work that they actually didn't do that they should have. And oftentimes contractors don't want to be held to that standard. And so the contractors actually working our programs get paid pretty well. I think part of my question here is the contractors that we're talking about that would get these incentives, who would they be, and would they be working outside of the programs? And if they're working outside of the programs, how do they know that their customers are low-income customers?
I don't have an answer to that because I feel like that is part of the program development that would have to occur if this recommendation is enacted.
Nicola?
Yeah, I think I would like to echo what was said in the room. I'm sorry, I couldn't determine who made the comments, but about providing the training to the contractors, about promoting the more clean technology going forward. And so that is something that would be good to subsidize training for that awareness. And then that is also that potentially could be subsidized. If it is more cost effective for the contractor to install another gas system, then maybe the subsidies, if they can make up for that difference to go to the heat pump, then the contractor would not have the incentive to keep going with the gas furnace.
And this does actually remind me of the beginning of our call here. This leans into the need for the contractor hub that Daryl was referencing. That can also help with that education and outreach and engaging the right organizations.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. How about Nicola, Scott? Thank you very much for bringing your perspective into this. I think that if there's additional thought that you want to send us in the next week to help us flesh this out, I think that'd be great. One thing I want to remind everyone is that when the University of Maryland produced the pathway report, looking at the policy options that the state should consider as we move toward a more decarbonized economy, one of the policies that was suggested and that they modeled was a zero emissions heating equipment standard, which is the idea of a regulatory framework that would mean that in the future, by some date, new heating systems would be zero emissions heating systems. So I guess if under that regulatory framework, you might not have the situation where the contractors have the option of installing combustion equipment in the future, because the requirement would be that what they're installing is zero emissions heating equipment.
In the interest of time, shall we move on to the BEPS incentives?
Yeah.
We have about 15 minutes left, but there's time for public comment, so we really only have about 5 to 10 minutes left.
Yeah.
I'm not going to spend too long on this because this is more of a need for a conversation. So before I move on, I just want to state that we are still here as the technical analyst and partner for this whole task force. And so those analyses that we did are some of what we can do, just to keep in mind as we're trying to hone in on these recommendations. This final piece is focused on the fact that there's been a lot of requests for some sort of incentive or other financial support from the state to support commercial buildings complying with the Building Energy Performance Standard. There's no specific analysis because what has also come up is that there are so many different ways to do that, that there's not been a clear enough ask for what would be the most valuable, whether that be a financial incentive, whether that be a tax credit, whether that be better financing or more accessible financing. There are different options. So if we go to the next slide, these are just a few examples of what is being done in other locations. And there are options to consider, but and they could be used as models, but without a more clear understanding of what would be most valuable to that group of buildings, large commercial covered buildings, it's difficult to place a specific point on that analysis. So Washington, D.C. has added additional funding to the Sustainable Energy Trust Fund, which can go towards supporting affordable housing complying with BEPS. Washington State has the Early Adopter Incentive Program, which provides a flat incentive to buildings that apply and actually achieve compliance in a certain amount of time. And California has an incentive based on emissions reduction. So there are definitely different approaches to this that are out there, but it's still very new to have incentives and related to BEPS. So specific recommendations can be evaluated further.
Do we know if those are federal funds?
These are all state funds, I think, except for the 30 million that is listed as federal funds specifically.
Yeah, specifically focused on state or district funding to support the conversation here.
Okay.
Just want to pick up. Go ahead.
I'm going to leave it there in the interest of time.
Just want to pick up on a comment that Michael Hindle made online about greenhouse gas and refrigerants. So some refrigerants have a much higher global warming potential than others. And so it might be good to incentivize lower global warming potential refrigerants as part of the effort. Because again, incentives are what people follow.
There is actually a carbon market for lower natural global warming potential refrigerants, which can be a way to get some sort of financing around that.
Are there comments from folks, task force members in the room or online on the question of incentives for building subject to BEPS and the feeling of what the need here is? This is an attempt, I think, to try to come up with something a bit more concrete than the sort of tax incentive recommendations. Recommendation for recommendation, and try to put some numbers to it, but wanted to understand what folks were thinking.
I know that we had seen at some point, like a breakdown of the three building types. At what point are we going to get some more specifics about who these 9,000 buildings belong to? Because I think that it may influence, in other words, I can tell you what the kinds of things that I could use for the 26 buildings in Baltimore County government needs to worry about. I can't tell about the other 8,975. So I think that would be helpful for us to provide input.
Yeah, it's on my program's to-do list to enter a new contract to go further in the covered building analysis. So we have the preliminary covered building analysis, which allowed us to just estimate that there are about 9,000 covered buildings in Maryland. There's more GIS work that's going to have to happen. And we are, don't hold your breath, because we still need to go through contracting to initiate that project.
I can tell you which my 26 are.
That's helpful. We've been chewing on this a lot about, what is the incentive program for the large buildings? And one thing, Director Pinsky, that I keep on coming back to is, I think, a comment that you made where, and if I remember the LBNL analysis, they ballpark that maybe 50% of the cost of compliance is financeable. And I think maybe you made the point, if it's financeable, that should, let the building owners finance it. let's look beyond that. At what point do you have these difficult to finance project costs? And then within that window, what part of that is appropriate for the state to provide financial support for? We haven't been able to kind of frame that up in terms of what would that program look like, and then how much might that cost the state. But I guess we're looking for additional input on, what is the structure that we think is needed for this sort of incentive? Because AECOM is at the ready to be able to crunch some numbers around it. We just don't have enough of a framework. Like, we didn't hear enough detail from the subgroups to frame up what that incentive program should look like.
And again, I could be off on this, Mark. Ultimately, they should be saving money. And after they decarbonize, hopefully, technology continues and gas prices keep going up. At some point, it should turn, and the payback, and I don't know if that's the same as the financing. I don't know if they're the same or different. In other words, if the upfront cost normally will take 8, 10, 12, whatever number of years, and the equipment will survive 20 years, the last 6, 8, 10 years, they should be getting some money. They should be making some money. Now, I think we have to have something reasonable, since they're privately owned and that is our economic system, to get to a point where they can make their profit and do this without going under. We don't want to close buildings, whether it's commercial, multifamily, whatever. And again, this is not my expertise of modeling. I just remember the original E3 report for the Climate Commission, who said in virtually all cases, not every case, but in virtually all cases, putting in heat pumps will save the money, ultimately. Now, at what point that it kicks in, I don't know. So, and I don't know if we have this is an econometric or a modeling or what, but it seems to me that our guidepost should be reasonable investment, a reasonable year in terms of you have to wait for the return, and obviously if they can get financing. And then if that stumbles, or it's going to get to the point of putting a company under, if they are managing it appropriately, that's when the state should step in with some incentives. And again, I can't quantify that. I don't have that expertise, but in my head, that's the frame I think about.
Yeah. Susan?
There used to be a company called Interlock. I don't know if it still exists or not, and how they would finance energy. If they would do energy efficiency for big buildings and manufacturing, and they would go in and tell you what you should do to make your building more efficient and do it for you, and how you paid them for them. And it is in the savings. If you save 10% a year from your energy efficiency, they got 3% a year until they were paid off. So that essentially you weren't paying them out of your immediate pocket, you were paying them out of your savings. So I don't know if that kind of financing could be designed.
That's the energy as a service contract.
For performance contracting, same concept.
I see two hands online, Nicholas and Mark, and then we're gonna take additional public comments and then wrap up.
Sure, this is Nick speaking, and I'm with HASI. We are an investor in many of these energy as a service transactions, as well as various other forms of financial vehicles, including commercial PACE. That's, I think, been mentioned a couple times. I think everything that was said about the nature of savings paying for the cost of equipment being installed is accurate. I think the holdup and where a lot of these incentives ought to address is the costs that come before a project or a building is financing ready. So sort of be it the pre-development costs for a given project or the market building costs of building the ecosystem and the connections and whatever standardization is needed within the market is where there are costs that a project financier is not going to cover and is usually the barrier and the obstacle to projects and buildings becoming financeable. So I would suggest that state agencies be thinking about utilizing their money in that way rather than for projects themselves, which generally speaking, again, are largely financeable. And for the gap of projects that are not financeable, I agree with the various comments around green banks and other less traditional lenders and investors that is not necessarily the broader private capital markets serving that role to be able to fund those projects so that eventually they are able to then turn around to the capital markets and bring in banks, other institutional investors and lenders that you typically think of that would fund these projects once you reach a critical mass. And I think, again, utilizing state funds or incentives to build up those institutions and those ecosystems is, from my point of view, how money ought to be thought of rather than how do we fund projects? Where does the capital come from? Because generally speaking, the private capital will solve that problem if the foundations and the roadmap is built ahead of time.
Okay, Mark from OPC.
Yeah, I appreciate this conversation. I want to echo both of what Director Pinsky said and what the last speaker said, and also just I don't have a particular suggestion along the lines of what was just said, but I wanted to point out that this conversation is based on the need to recognize the cost savings that these sorts of improvements will result in, and therefore to make incentives as targeted as possible and really make sure that there's a value add. That's actually in the law itself. I'm looking at the section of the Climate Solutions Now Act that authorized this task force, and one of the charges is to make recommendations on targeting incentives to electrification projects that would not otherwise result in strong returns on investment for building owners. So that just sort of supports this discussion and the need to think about that particular language when comparing what Maryland should do with what other jurisdictions are already doing.
We're almost at time here, so are there other public comments that want to be made at this time? Michael?
Yeah, hi. I'm curious. I haven't been able to attend every meeting, but has there been an analogous cost comparison for building envelope retrofits and heat pumps? Because if we deal with our building enclosures, we get a reduction in the overall demand. It also helps reduce peak demand, and it might have a life cycle of 100 years as opposed to 20 years. So I'm just wondering if I always see cost benefit analysis going to heat pumps, and I'm not complaining. I think what Julia's put together is great. It's necessary, but it seems like the idea of retrofitting the building is assumed to be another problem, and it's not related. But I think you've got to reduce overall demand. Ben Rausch responded to my comment in the chat saying that there are pretty aggressive energy intensive EUI, energy intensity standard reductions in the BEPS draft. So I support that. But has there been a comparable study?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, E3 performed a study for us that's called the Maryland Building Decarbonization Study. And they were basically trying to look for the lowest cost pathways to decarbonize the building sector. Shell improvements and insulation packages were among the things that they included in that model. So yeah, we have been looking at that as well. We are at time. We didn't get to the revenue generating ideas discussion. We'll revisit that in a couple of weeks when we come back together. If you have thoughts on any of the draft material that was shared today, again, within the next week, if you could send us your thoughts on wording choice, especially ideas around this, the kind of large building incentive program, that would be really, really helpful. So with that, yours to wrap up.
We're adjourned. Thank you. Appreciate your time today.
Director Pinsky, was your statement that you can make fun of someone, because they're not here, a warning to not miss any meetings?
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Being graded on our absences.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julia.
Lisa. Good job.
I'm just getting everything from the chat.
Yeah, I copied everything from the chat into a Google Doc.
Awesome. Thank you. I think I got everything now.